What's up, peeps? I'm back again with less hair, a messier desk, and the same level of whiteness. And I'm finally going to wrap up this godforsaken series that I always forget the name of, and I say series too many times. I'm going to wrap up my How This Thing Works series with part 4, where I'm going to explain how to use ISO, shutter speed, and aperture all together. I don't know what this hand gesture means. So welcome back for part 4, the finale of this dumb little thing that I made for no reason at all. It's not necessarily the final tutorial, but it's the final in the little beginner's package thing that I made. What I'm going to talk about is how to use your shutter speed, how to use your aperture, how to use your ISO, and how to use them all three together. If you're seeing this video first, I actually made 3 separate videos where I talked about those individual functions. To really get an idea of what I'm talking about, you need to have a real understanding of shutter speed and of aperture, because they're sort of the main two. ISO, if you watched my previous video, I talked about how I kind of use it as a last resort. So I'm not necessarily using that as like going into a picture. I'm using that after I set up shutter speed and my aperture. I need to just sort of put a disclaimer saying that everything I'm talking about is completely dependent on the amount of light that you have. Because obviously if you're doing taking pictures at night, then you're gonna have a different set of circumstances as opposed to shooting in the early morning or like, you know, at noon or at sunset or with, you know, with a flash or some other kind of like lights. The basic relationship between them is individually they both make the picture either darker or lighter depending on where you're at on the scale. Generally, I would say know what type of picture you want to take going into it. So if you're doing a landscape, you're probably going to want a ton of stuff in focus. And if you're familiar with aperture, if you watched my previous video, I talked about how the higher you have your aperture set, but say like an f20, the more that's going to be in focus. So if you're doing a landscape, then you're probably going to want to be at, you know, something that's going to have most of it in focus. So you're going to have your aperture pretty small, therefore letting in less light. So you're going to be setting it at, say, like f18, we'll say. In that case, in order to get the light in, then you have to lower your shutter speed to let more light in. So now you're going to have to drop it down to, say, a 20th of a second, maybe even do a long exposure, say like a 1 second or 2 second. That's sort of the balance. If you make one darker, you gotta make the other one lighter. Unless you're trying to take a specific picture, 1/2000th of a second with an f18 is going to be a really pitch black dark image. And an f2.8 and a 1/10 of a second is going to be a very bright image. So again, know the kind of picture you want to take going into it, and then sort of balance your settings out after that. When ISO comes into play is that, say, when I use this lens here, this is my 150 to 500 millimeter lens. This is probably what I use ISO with the absolute most. Since it is such a big zoom lens, I have to use a pretty high shutter speed, because the shutter speed you typically want to be around the millimeter that you're shooting with. So since this goes to 500, I want to be somewhere in the ballpark of 500ths of a second. I can go way above that as much as I want, but just in terms of my lowest should be around that. So I have to shoot this at 500th of a second, which is a lot. And I usually use this to take pictures of birds, so I typically want to have my aperture set f8 or something like that, where I have a little bit of play, because since they move around so much. I don't think a bird's ever done this in its life. So in order to compensate for that, I have to use the ISO and bump it up to, say, like a 400 or a, 800. If I go too high, then I'm gonna get a ton of noise, and then since I'm already kind of cropping the image anyway, that noise is going to show up like crazy. This is like my ISO lens almost. I can change my settings on my camera as I'm shooting here. So for instance, I'm at 1/30th of a second shooting at f7.1 and my ISO is at 640. Reason for that being 1/30th in video on my camera is the lowest shutter speed I can use. f7.1, I just chose something that was more towards the middle of my aperture range, because the lens I'm shooting with, it'll go down to 2.8 and it'll go all the way up to I think 32 maybe. So I wanted something towards the middle, so I had a ton in focus since I kind of am moving around and I'm doing different stuff. But since I'm doing that, then I bump my ISO up to 640, so that way a little more exposure, so I'm not as sort of dark and in shadow and as terrifying. And this looks like some sort of kidnapping video. I said it's at 1/30th of a second right now. If I was switch it to 1/100th of a second, it takes me down to that. As you can see, it's not, I mean, you can still see me. I'm still there and everything, but in terms of your image, you're going to have to recover some of that. So say if I 200th of a second, so it's pretty dark. So in order for expose for this, I'm going to open my aperture up to say 2.8, which is what it's at right now. I'm going to put it back to where it was. If I default the ISO back down to 100, we're about in that same range that I showed you whenever I upped it to about 200th of a second. Going back to what I was talking about with knowing the picture you want to take, my sort of biggest concern with shooting this video right now is having sort of wide area of depth of field. So having the shutter speed as low as it can go and having the aperture where I want it, it's obviously not as exposed as I'd like it. So I actually bumped my ISO up to 640. which then gives me this, and I think this is much better. So that's kind of just a way I can show you kind of what I'm talking about in sort of a real world sense without going into a bunch of crazy examples. Like I said, I've probably said it about 4 times now, but it's just knowing the type of picture you want to go for and then understanding how to get that picture is the most important thing. So if you know that the higher your shutter speed is, the more it's going to freeze like action and movement, and that's what you kind of need. Say if you're taking a picture of like a hummingbird, then you know that you're going to make up for that somehow, either using ISO or to open up your aperture as much as you possibly can. Or if you have your shutter speed super high and you still want to maintain a high aperture, then you have to use your ISO even more to then balance out that exposure. Like I said, everything in photography is just a balancing act. So it's either trying to get the shutter speed you want with the aperture you want without putting too much ISO into it, and maybe playing a little bit, maybe lowering your shutter speed a tiny bit, or changing your aperture a little bit. Now, those 2 functions in and out is super important for whatever image you're trying. I don't care what type of photography you're doing. You're gonna have to know them inside and out regardless. If you just go out and just start messing with shutter speed and going really high and going really low on, say, if there's like a creek near your house or something like that, or even with a hose or whatever it is, it gives you such a better understanding of what this function does. And same thing with aperture. Just start, opening up wide and seeing how small your depth of field is, and take it down to as small as it can possibly go, f32 or something, and then see how much is in focus and everything else, and just see how that affects it. And just trying to just use them together and just practicing with it, and see if one of your friends will stand in place for you to take their picture, or, I don't know, bribe them with free pictures of their kids or their dogs or something. People love pictures. They can't say no to free pictures. Well, they can. And they have. That's pretty much going to do it. Like I said, if you have any questions or curiosities on the individual functions, I've made 3 other videos that I've posted already for aperture, for shutter speed, and ISO, so you can go back and check those out. I'm posting tutorials every Wednesday on different either functions with the camera, or for editing, for just different techniques, or just what specific things are that people just never got a full explanation of. And then just sprinkled in here and there, I'm going to do different like vlog kind of content. I mean, I consider this vlog kind of content, but different stuff where like I take you guys with me to then go out and get pictures. I hope this helped you out, and I'll see you on the next one. I still have yet to figure out an outro. That's stupid.